Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I hope you had a fantastic celebration of the 4th of July, commemorating the liberty of our country, our Day of Independence. Here in America, and look, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish whatsoever. Our country is currently facing some extreme, incredible challenges. Um, it's frightening. I don't believe. In fact, I said this to someone relatively recently. Had you told me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that America was going to be in the condition it's in right now as a result of horrible, horrible political decisions and horrible, horrible political leaders, I would have been in denial. I said, no, 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 no. America will remain strong, and yet America right now is not respected by her enemies at all. America is literally the brunt of jokes and overseas. We are now seeing, and so far as I know, not one thing has been done about it. But just over the last several days, as a matter of fact, almost immediately after the recent presidential debate, there were actually entertainers, American entertainers, and newscasters on the internet openly calling for Biden to assassinate Donald Trump. This is staggering. Now, I haven't heard whether the Department of Justice or the FBI is going to make any arrests in this case, but we all know that if Donald Trump had made a comment suggesting that Biden be killed, or if any Republican senator or if any conservative commentator, for instance, if Bill O'Reilly called for Donald Trump to assassinate Biden, O'Reilly would be in prison, but would be in jail before the day is over. So we've got some horrific things going on in America. I mean, it's staggering how challenging. So I didn't want to go on a rant there, but I did want to point out that in spite of all the negativity that we're seeing in our country right now, it's still the greatest country in the world. And I thank God every day that I'm an American. I thank God every day for the liberties that I have. And I hope that you feel the same way. I'm not defending everything that America has done wrong, which is a lot. I'm just simply saying there's not another country in the world that has and that offers what America offers. You know, why don't you see, with all of the rhetoric about how terrible America is, and oh, we are imperialistic, fascist, we're this and we're that. Why aren't we seeing? Why are we not seeing Americans illegally migrating, to Mexico or to Russia or to China? How about that? Why is it that people are leaving all of these other socialist, imperialistic? Why are they not leaving all of these communistic countries, or America, leaving America to go there? Why is it that people from those countries are coming here? It's because America is a great country. Now, some of them have ulterior motives, but that's another thing. Okay, sorry about that. No, I'm not. I'm not a bit sorry. So, we're going to continue today our examination and response to Andrew Perriman in an article that was posted in actually the year 2015. And the article is entitled 20 Reasons Why Babylon Was Rome, Not Jerusalem. Now, as I've said before, I have a great deal of respect for Andrew Perriman and his book especially, The Coming of the Son of Man. And there's a great deal that he says that I really, truly appreciate and respect. But his article attempting to set forth Babylon as Rome, I believe is absolutely chock full of wrong assumptions. I believe that it's absolutely full of misinterpretations of New Testament text. And as a result of that, I wanted to review it. Now, as I said at the very outset of this review, I'm not going to examine every single thing that he said because I've already covered it in my response to the book, The Future of Rome, and the chapter written by Peter Oakes. So I'm skipping over several points in Andrew Perriman's article in order to get to the issues that I didn't really cover in my review of the book, Future of Rome. So skipping down in his 20 reasons, past numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8, I want to look at number 9. He says the pagan enemies of the persecuted Thessalonian believers will be judged, quote, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God. Now, first of all, Andrew Perriman is wrongly identifying the persecutors in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. The persecutors who are persecuting the church are identified in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, in which Paul said that the Thessalonians had joined with their brethren in Judea by being persecuted by the Jews. Now, some like to argue, well, Paul said that the Thessalonians were being persecuted by their countrymen. And somehow, some way, that supposedly means they were not being persecuted by the Jews, but they were being persecuted by the pagans. Well, in the first place, in Acts chapter 17, who was it that began to persecute and who instigated all of the persecution against the church at Thessalonica? It was the unbelieving Jews. That's simply undeniable. And so when Andrew Perriman almost essentially ignores that testimony and says, well, it was the pagan enemies persecuting the church, I believe that's a serious case of misidentification. And we have to ask the question, if the argument were to be made, well, the Thessalonians were being persecuted by their countrymen. Why does that indicate that it wasn't the Jews? Were the Jews of the synagogue in Thessalonica, were they not the countrymen, the fellow countrymen of the church? I mean, after all, the church was established in the synagogue. It wasn't established, in the temple of Dionysius. It wasn't established in the temple of Zeus. It wasn't established in the temple of Athena. It was established in the synagogue of the Jews. And it was the unbelieving Jews who stirred up the women and who stirred up then the base fellows, as it's called, in the marketplace to persecute the church. Probably paid them money. But the point of it is, it's the Jews who are the movers and the shakers and the instigators. So I really believe that Andrew Perriman is misguided here to suggest that Paul is referring to pagan persecutors. I'm not denying that the base men of the agora, that is the marketplace, I'm not denying that they would have been Gentiles. I'm simply saying that they weren't concerned about the gospel being preached in the synagogue, for crying out loud. If they were pagans, but they most assuredly were not concerned about it. They are, to use the terminology, they're hired hitmen to persecute the Christians. So this is a mischaracterization. And then Perriman says, more to the point, the Caesar-like man of lawlessness who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, pardon me, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, will be brought to nothing by the appearance of Jesus' coming. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 3-8. As in Daniel, the appearance of the Son of Man is closely linked to the destruction of the blasphemous pagan opponent of God's people. Well, once again, I believe this is a serious error in interpretation. Paul is very specific here. This man of sin, you just got to catch this, would sit, as actually it's in the present tense if I remember correctly, would sit in the temple of God. Listen, folks, this cannot and does not refer to a pagan emperor in Rome sitting in the temple of God. Period. End of story. Who did sit in the temple of God? Who better fits the description here of this man of lawlessness? Who sat in the temple of God, who exalted himself above all that is called God. And somebody says, well, the high priest would have considered that to be blasphemous. No, he was acting in the place of God. And most of all, he was sitting in the temple. Whoever you identify as the man of sin, he had to sit in the temple of God. And that's not the church at all. I was raised believing that Paul's description of the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was talking about the Roman Catholic Pope. Well, I no longer believe that. I think that's untenable. Because you have to jump forward 400 years to find a pope, quote, sitting in the temple of God, i.e. the church, unquote. And that doesn't work temporally speaking. Why? Well, because whoever the man of sin was, point number one, he was alive when Paul wrote. You know what is withholding him. Well, you can't withhold something or someone who is not already there and not already active. It's just impossible. So the restrainer was already restraining the man of sin. So who was restraining, let's say, who was restraining the Romans? Nobody really was restraining the Romans. Had they wanted to persecute. Now, here's something absolutely critical. You really got to catch the power of this. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul is saying, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, who are persecuting you. Well, here's a fact. The Romans were not persecuting the church in Thessalonica when Paul wrote in 50 AD. Even the Neronian persecution didn't come along for another decade and a half. So it's absolutely historically, chronologically improper to say Paul is dealing with the Roman Empire as the persecutor. Second point, Domitian, as I pointed out many, many times, there is a growing body of evidence to suggest Domitian never persecuted the church. Pardon me. He assuredly did not persecute the church at Thessalonica. No record whatsoever, not a word in any Roman historians about such a Domitianic persecution. And yet remember, Paul is very clear. It is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are, that's a present participle, who are troubling you, who are persecuting you. We'll go back to Acts chapter 17. Who was it that instigated the persecution? Who was it that was guilty of the instigation? It wasn't the Romans, and it most assuredly was not the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's anachronistic, ladies and gentlemen, to project the identity of the persecutor of the Thessalonians and to reach out 300 or 400 years and extrapolate that backwards, or to extrapolate the persecution in Thessalonica forward for 400 years to fall under the rule and the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. First Pope didn't really come along for several hundred years, obviously. We cannot engage in such an anachronistic hermeneutic, ladies and gentlemen. It does violence to the text. And to drive home that point, let me say once again with emphasis, the Roman Catholic Pope did not sit in the temple of God when Paul wrote as the persecutor of the church. Because after all, the one who's sitting, the man of sin, who is currently, when Paul wrote, sitting in the temple of God, he is the persecutor. He's the one actively persecuting. Well, again, that rules out Nero. That rules out the base men of the agora, the marketplace. That rules out any Gentile force, because whoever the man of sin was, who was alive when Paul wrote, was then sitting in the temple of God. And again, they were actively persecuting the church. And so to reiterate, I believe that Andrew Perriman's interpretation that he brings to the text of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and chapter 2, I believe is completely misguided. It assumes that there was a pagan persecution against the church by the one sitting in the temple of God. I'm sorry, textually, there is no connection here. Logically, there's no connection here. And it will not do to say, oh, well, the man of sin isn't the one doing the persecuting. Really? He's the one that blasphemes the church, the name of Christ. He is the enemy of God in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He sets himself up in the temple as the enemy of God. And let me point this out very, very quickly. We need to do a better job of identifying the enemy of Christ in the New Testament. Paul, in writing to the Philippians, identified the Jews who were withstanding his ministry, attempting to kill him. And he said that Paul said, there are many, and he's talking about the Jews, there are many of whom I now speak, and I write even now with tears. They are the enemies of the cross. Who's he talking about? The Jews. In Romans chapter 11, verse 28 to 30, he is talking about the conversion, the hopeful conversion of those who were at that very time. He said, in regards to the gospel, they are the enemies of Christ. They're the enemies of the gospel. Well, guess what those enemies of the gospel were doing? When Paul wrote, they were persecuting the church in Rome, in Corinth, in Philippi, everywhere in the Roman Empire. You do remember, don't you? There was a band of 40 men who took a vow to kill Paul or to die of starvation if they couldn't do it. They followed Paul everywhere. Everywhere that Paul went, the Jews went, attempting to stir up persecution. They are the enemies. And in Luke chapter 19, Jesus told about a certain nobleman that went into a far country there to receive a kingdom. While he was there, an ambassador sent men went up into that far country, and they said, "We will not have this man to rule over us." That parable is illustrating Jesus, who ascended into heaven to receive the kingdom. And the Jews said, "We will not have this man to rule over us." They're his enemies. So everywhere we go in the New Testament, we find testimony as to exactly who the enemies of Christ, the enemies of the cross, truly were. So when we come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we read about the man of sin, he is the Antichrist. He is the one who stands against Christ. Who was that? You remember that when Paul, in Acts chapter 18, was brought before Gallio, a Roman ruler, when he perceived that this was just a dispute between the Jews and this nascent group of believers in Jesus, in other words, it was an issue of theology, he booted the Jews out of his court and had them beaten. This is not Roman persecution of the church. Basically, he just said, get out of my court. Case dismissed. Don't bother me with this, you troublesome Jews. Over and over and over in the New Testament, ladies and gentlemen, we find the Jews identified, never the Romans. We find the Jews identified as the enemies of the cross. How then do we come to 2 Thessalonians chapters 1 and 2, as Andrew Perriman does, and insert the pagans into the text as the enemies of Christ? I think it's untenable. I think it's just simply misguided. I think it is bad interpretation. Well, I'm going to leave it there right now for this video. Thank you so much for joining me. By the way, let me encourage you to get a copy of my book, Who Is This Babylon? Go to my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. Go to the store, order a copy of the book, Who Is This Babylon? And send me a note. When you order it, send me a note that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping, and that's going to save you $7.50. All right? Be sure to join Mike Sullivan and me. I really apologize that I couldn't be with Mike last Friday. I ate a sandwich and before the program, and I spent the rest of the evening, rest of the night, fighting off having to go, upchuck. So I may not eat before the show tonight. All right. Anyway, hope to see you tonight. God bless.